Welcome to Helpful Hints for Chapter 2, where we will discuss some ICD-10-CM coding conventions. Before we get started, please remember from 1274, your intro class, that ICD-10-CM coding convention and guidelines are always at your disposal in the front of your code book. Let's first look at exclusion notes. An excludes one note means not coded here, while an excludes two note means not included here. So what's the difference? Taking a closer look here in the tabular list for M86 category osteomyelitis, excludes one means that the excluded code should never be used at the same time as the code above the note. So for example, looking at the tabular list here again for osteomyelitis, the code for Salmonella osteomyelitis is not coded here, not coded to category M86. Instead, it would be coded to A02.24. Now let's look at an example of an excludes two note, meaning not included here. The excluded condition is not part of the condition represented by the code. In our same example of osteomyelitis in the tabular list here, an excludes two note serves as a flag or a warning, if you will, that the patient, for example, if the patient had osteomyelitis of the orbit, then none of the M86 category codes would be applicable, but an H05.0 code would. Osteomyelitis of the orbit is not included in the M86 category. However, the two codes could be used together at the same time. You could have an M86 code coded at the same time as this H05 code for the orbit. That does not hold true for the excludes one note codes. Let's take a look at two more coding conventions, this time the abbreviations NEC and NOS. Not elsewhere classified, not otherwise specified, or unspecified. NEC indicates that there is no separate code for the condition, even though the medical documentation that we have is very specific. So let's take a look at the example of ischial bursopathy. Remember that the ischium is the lower or base part of the pelvic bone. However, there is no subterm for ischium listed under bursopathy. So we have a very specific diagnosis statement, but there is no specificity matching under bursopathy in the subterms. So the type is specified, but not elsewhere classified, code M71.88. Now let's consider NOS, or not otherwise specified. NOS codes should only be used when the medical documentation is lacking the specific details that it needs. The documentation is unspecified. For example, let's say that the physician just documents bursopathy. That's it. That's the whole diagnosis. No other details are given. Then the unspecified code of M71.9 would be used, as there is no information in the record to identify one of the subterms. Those unspecified codes almost always end in .9. Parentheses are used in the alphabetic index and in the tabular list to denote non-essential modifiers. In other words, terms that are not essential to the code assignment. For example, looking at the main term of hemophilia. You see these terms listed in parentheses. classical, familial, hereditary. These are all inconsequential to the code assignment. They are not essential when we're assigning the code. So whether the documentation states classical acquired hemophilia or hereditary acquired hemophilia or just acquired hemophilia, the code would be the same for any of these options. So again, these are just supplemental words that may or may not be present in the medical documentation, but either way, they do not affect the code assignment. Another punctuation consideration is the use of square brackets. Used in the alphabetic index, square brackets denote manifestation codes, which means that both codes shown must be listed and in the same order. So for example, let's take a look here. For Alzheimer's disease, early onset Alzheimer's disease without a behavioral disturbance. So the code G30.3 is used for the early onset Alzheimer's disease, and the F02.80 denotes the manifestation of this disease. How is this disease presenting? In this case, the Alzheimer's disease is presenting as dementia, which is the code F02.80. Now, on the other hand, square brackets used in the tabular list, this just helps to denote synonyms, alternative wordings, or any explanatory phrases. So here's a good example. In this case, varicella. Another word for varicella, or a synonym, if you will, is chickenpox. We've got these square brackets going on in the tabular list. Dashes, when these are seen in the alphabetic index, this just tells you that the code is incomplete. It is not valid, so that you're going to have to go to the tabular list and make sure that you're pulling in all of the necessary characters to make this a valid code. So more characters need to be added. So for example, a pathological fracture of the ankle, we have this dash here. It's telling us, hey, more characters are needed. We need to go to the tabular list and pull in more information, more characters. In this case, probably something similar to the left or right ankle. A few relational terms from the code book to have on your radar screen. In the tabular list, the term and really means and or. So for example, let's look at an example here from the tabular list again. Chronic osteomyelitis with draining sinus, right radius, and ulna. But really, and means and or. So you could have documentation that says chronic osteomyelitis with draining sinus, right ulna. And that would be okay. You would still use this same code. So just remember, and in the tabular list means and or. With or in means associated or due to. So remember, we've talked about this before, that the subterm with is not listed in alphabetical order as a subterm. It is usually listed first. So here you see it under endocarditis. We have the subterm with, and note how it comes before the A subterm, such as acute or aortic. Everything else would be in alphabetical order. And then the relational term due to, this just shows a causal relationship. So for example, code A0832. This just means that the enteritis is due to or caused by the astrovirus. Thanks for joining me. Happy coding!